Hello everybody. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how current row filtering works when you are using the measure revisor, which will be very similar to how it works when using the calculate revisor. So in a lot of ways, this is going to be kind of a repeat of what we've already seen, but it's going to be a useful repeat because you're going to get a better sense of just how close measures are to the calculate function. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started, shall we? I am here in Filter Revisors Part 1.xosx, and I'm on the Measure Current Row tab, and here we have a bit of code that is very similar to what we had before, if you know how to look at it, right? So this is shorter than what we looked at last time, but it's actually going to let us do the exact same thing as in the Calculate Current Row tab. Just like before, we're going to use the average X iterator to go get a table, a temp table, of all the different shifts. For each one, we're going to calculate the total units, and then we're going to average the results. This is what we did before, but now we're using a measure for it, right? So what's different is before, the revisor that we used was calculate. So we actually typed out in our main body of code here the calculate function, and then inside of it, as argument 1, we also typed out the expression, or I typed it out. You guys just got to watch it. This time in our code, right? Average X, here on line 3, we don't use the calculate function and then actually type in an expression, right? We use the measure total units, which is itself a revisor, right? Just like calculate. And the sub-expression is predefined. This is defined in our data model, right? But it's going to do the same thing, right? For every single row, it's going to revise the filters. Then it's going to be able, in that new revised set of filters, to run this sub-expression. It's going to do that row by row. Okay. So let's just go ahead and get into it, right? And I think I'm waving my hands a little bit too much here. Let's just start doing this thing. So what are we going to do here? Well, average X, we're going to start by getting a temp table using this derivation right there, all the different values of shift. Just like before, we're going to start with an empty filter context, so we're going to get 1, 2 shifts, lunch and dinner. Still no breakfast at this particular diner. Still no breakfast. Maybe they should add it, maybe they shouldn't. They don't have it now. So shift is lunch and dinner, right? So this is the temp table that is the result of that derivation right there. Go get all the visible values of shift with no filters in place, lunch and dinner. And now we're going to add an expression column with this definition right here, right? This definition right there, which by the way is a reference to this measure down here. So I'm going to come down here, I'm going to type in EXP. And I've already got some of this stuff filled out when I hit enter, right? So we're run the code we're going to run for each and every row is just the measure total units. It's a reference to that measure. It says, go run the measure total units for this row and go run it for this row, right? Okay, so let's start with this first row right here. I'm going to go ahead and right-click on it, and I'm going to just highlight this. I'm going to highlight this right there, right? Which, by the way, is the same as this right here. So let's highlight that right there. For that cell, we're going to run the value of the expression column, or the instructions for the expression column, which is that right there. So we're going to go run total units for each and every row. Okay, good. So let's do that. Let's go ahead and run the total units measure. Well, total units is a revisor just like calculate. And just like calculate, it has a sub-expression that it wants to run under a revised set of filters. Okay? So whenever you see a revisor, be it calculate or measure, especially calculate, but also true of measures, the first thing that you want to do, you need to really get good at this, is with your eyes, with your mind's eye, freeze that sub-expression and remind yourself this is only going to run after the filters have been revised. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I've selected those cells right there, and I'm going to go paint it with this dark or the light blue color, so it's like a big block of ice. Okay. So the total units measure wants to run this sub-expression for that cell right there, but before it can run it, it has to revise the filters, right? To revise the filters, there's 2 steps, right? If there's any values of the current row, it's going to perform current row filtering and add them as filters, also known as context transition. And then if there are any override filters provided as additional arguments, it will add those as well. Okay, well, are there any values of the current row? Sure are. Shift equals lunch. So the measure, total units, is going to go ahead and add shift equals lunch as a filter. So I'm going to click right there, type in shift is lunch, and calculate's going to take that and add it to the filter context. And it's going to add it just like this. So I'm going to hold down control to make a copy of it. It's slightly more technically accurate to say it moves it rather than makes a copy, but again, I want to see it both there and there, so I made a copy. Okay, so the measure, total units, being a revisor, performed current row filtering, added the current rows values of filter, shift equals lunch. Now, if there are any additional arguments to total units, it would add those as override filters. And if you look right here at line 3, there's no additional arguments being added to a measure. Now, even if you've been using DAX for a long, long time, you've probably never seen an example of providing an extra argument to a measure, but it's something you can do. We're actually going to do that in a future video. But for right now, I'll just say that no, there's no additional arguments being provided, which means there's no additional override filters. So we only do current row filtering. There are no override filters. Hey, the total units measure is done revising the filters for that cell right there. So now let's go ahead and filter down to lunch so we can see what the measure sees. Boom. Okay, now we've got our revised filter context for shift equals lunch. The total units measure can unfreeze its sub-expression and run it, right? Because the measures are now just right, just the way we want them. So we're going to take the sub-expression, we're going to unfreeze it. We're going to unfreeze it. There we go. And now we can run it in this new revised filter context. Okay, so what's the sub-expression? Go get all the visible rows of mini, add this column to it, sum up the results. Easy, easy. Control-C to copy. Come down here, Control-Alt-V to paste special. Click on values and hit OK. There we go. We've derived a temp table with all the visible rows of mini. So that's the temp table right there, the result of that derivation. And now we're going to pass it into the SumX iterator, which is going to add this column to it and sum up the results. So I'm going to click right here. Just like before, I've actually done all the hard work. I'm going to type in EXP. Once I hit enter, you'll see that we've actually already got the expression column. There we go. For each and every row, get the units. So for that row, we get 2. For that row, we get 1. For that row, we get 1. And for that row, we get 3. And then we sum it up because it's the SumX iterator. So 2 plus 1 plus 1 plus 3 equals 7. Good. So the actual answer for that cell right there is 7. But we're not quite done with this cell, right? The measure has run the sub-expression and gotten the number 7, but it's a good roommate. And by that, I mean it cleans up after itself. And by that, I mean it's made some changes to the filter to create a new revised filter context in order to run this sub-expression. But now that it's done with it, it can actually set the filters back to the way it found it. So to do that, I'm going to click this right here, Control-C to copy, and I'm just going to paste over that. That's my way of erasing that filter. And I'm also going to set this back and be good about that. Okay, good. So now we're done with that cell right there. Let's go ahead and unhighlight that. Now we need to worry about this cell right here because we're going to run this. This bit of code right here, the definition for the expression column, we're going to run it once per row. Okay, so we did it for the first row. Now we have to do it for the second. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight this. There we go. Okay. So what are we going to do here? Well, the definition for this particular cell is go run the measured total units. Well, the measured total units, well, it's a measure, so that means it's a revisor by definition. All measures are revisors. That's what a measure is, which means it has a sub-expression that it wants to run under a revised set of filters, a revised filter context. So whenever we see a revisor, especially calculate, but also measures, we want to, in our mind's eye, freeze that expression, the sub-expression, because we want to remind ourselves this is only going to run after the measure revises the filters. So I'm going to right-click on this, and I'm going to give it a nice light blue color to freeze that sub-expression, right? That's the sub-expression. It's going to run after we revise the filters. So how are we going to revise the filters? Well, just like all revisors, right? We're going to perform current row filtering, asking ourselves, are there any values of the current row we can add as filters, right? There's one for shift equals 0. Yep, we're going to add that. And then if there's any override filters, we'll add those as well. Okay, so let's start with the first one. Are there any values of the current row? Yeah, shift equals dinner. Okay, so I'm going to type in shift equals dinner right there. Okay, and now the measure, the total units measure, is going to take that value of the current row and add it as a filter. Add it as a filter. Maybe. Okay, so I'm going to click and drag. I'm going to hold down Control to make a copy. More accurate to say it moves it, but I like to see it both there and there, so I kind of made a copy. Good. Okay, so we just performed current row filtering. The measure said, are there any values in the current row? In the previous row, it saw the value for lunch, but in this row, it sees the value for dinner. So it took that value for shift equals dinner. It added it to the filter context, and now it's going to ask, are there any override filters? Well, in our code here, the measure, if there were override filters, there'd be a little opening parentheses and then the definition for all of our overrides, which I'll show you in a later video. But I don't see any of those. So there's no override filters, so we're done. The measure just performed current row filtering. There were no override filters. We are done revising the filter context, so now we can filter down to just shift equals dinner. Shift equals dinner. Okay, there we go. So now we're looking at shift equals dinner. Now that we've done that, the measure says, okay, I'm done revising the filters, right, for this particular cell. I can now unfreeze my sub-expression and run it in this new filter context. So I'm going to click on this stuff right here. The measure is going to get out its blow dryer, right, hot air gun, unfreeze that sub-expression, unfreeze it, and now we can run it in the new filter context. So what are we going to do? Go get all the visible rows of many, add that column to it, sum up the results. Control C to copy, come down here. Control Alt V to paste special. Click on values and hit OK. Okay. Now we're going to add this column to it, sum up the results. I'm going to click up here. I'm going to type in EXP. To add my expression column, I've actually pre-populated this. So as soon as I hit enter, we'll see that we've actually already got the formula in there. So for every single row, we get the units, because that's what it says to do right there. So for that row, we get 2. For that row, we get 1. And for that row, we get 2. And we're going to sum it up because it is the sum x function. So 2 plus 1 plus 2 equals 5, and that's the actual answer for that cell right there. 5 right there. But we're not done, right? Because measures, the total units measure in this case, but all measures, they're revisers, and revisers are good roommates, so they clean up after themselves. So the measure total units created a revised filter context with this filter for shift equals dinner in order to run this sub-expression in it. But now that it's done, it can set the filters back to the way it found it, right? So I'm going to click on this little patch of orange right there, Control C to copy, click on those two cells right there, Control V to paste to remove that filter, emulating what happens when the measure sets the filters back to the way it found it, okay? And since the filters are back to the way it found it, I'm going to go ahead and look at both dinner and lunch. There we go. Okay, now we're done with this cell. We are done with that cell right there. No fill at all. And we move on to the easiest bit. Oh, by the way, I should, let's set that as well. That's back to the way it was. So the average x function, we got all the values of shift, 1, 2 right there. We added this column to it. For every single row, we got the total units, ran the total units measure, 7 and 5, 7 for lunch, 5 for dinner. And now the average x function is going to average the results of this expression column, right? Well, this part should be pretty easy. Again, you don't have to be exceptionally good at math to do this bit. But the average of 7 and 5, if you were curious, is 6, which is the answer that we got right there. Okay, and that is the answer to this whole bit of code right there. Okay, so let's do this one more time. Let's do this one more time. It's useful to see over and over and over again to really kind of get the concept in your fingertips as best you can. As best you can. Okay, so now pretty similar. In fact, it's in a lot of ways it's identical to what we did for the second example in this tab right here, right? And it's in some ways it's also easier to think about, right? What are we going to do? We're going to get all the values of the dish column, right? For every single dish, we're going to calculate the total units for that dish, and we're going to average the results, right? That's sort of the business intuition. It's also kind of mechanically what happens, okay? But keep in mind, this is a reviser. So the bit that says for each and every dish, go look at the units just for that dish is the measure. The measure itself is what takes the values of the current row and adds them as filters. Okay, so let's actually go show you that, right? So average x over that table, right? So let's go get this derivation right there. Go get all the values of dish. Well, the filter context starts out empty just like before. So how many dishes are there? Well, there's pasta, burger, and salad just like before, right? Not a lot of expansive menu choices here at this particular restaurant, but that's okay. It will serve our needs nicely. So values of the mini dish, right? So we're going to go to all the values of dish, which is going to be pasta, burger, and salad, okay? And now average x is going to add a column with this definition to it and average the results. I'm going to come up here. I'm going to type in EXP. I hit enter, and what are we going to do? Well, for each and every row, we're going to run that definition for the expression column right there. For each row, we're going to run that bit of code, which is just total units. We could have put in total units times 2 or something like that if we wanted to, but here it's a very simple definition. It's just total units for each and every row, right? So let's start with this cell right here, with this cell right there. Click on that. Click on the little highlight color. Good. Okay. So what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Well, for that cell right there, it's only got one set of instructions. Go run the total units measure. Well, in our data model, we have a measure called total units. So it's going to go ahead and run that. Okay. And when it does, the first thing that's going to happen is total units, being a reviser, is going to revise the filters before it can run this sub expression. So anytime you see a measure the calculate function, any revisor, you need to, in your mind's eye, get good at freezing the sub-expression and remind yourself it's only going to run this after the measure revises the filters. Specifically, it's going to add a filter for pasta before it runs this stuff. Okay. Preview of coming attractions. Okay, let's freeze the sub-expression. So I'm going to go ahead. Actually, before I do that, I forgot to sort of highlight this line 3 right there, right? So this is that exact same code right there. Let me go ahead and do that. Sorry about that. There we go. Okay. So what are we going to do for that cell right there? Well, we're going to run total units. Before we can run the sub-expression for total units, we have to revise the filter. So we got to freeze this and remind ourselves we're only going to run it after we revise the filters. There we go. Okay. So how are we going to revise the filters for that cell right there? Well, we're going to do two things. Perform current row filtering, also known as context transition, asking, are there any current values of the current row we want to add as filters? Or are there any values of the current row? If so, we will add them as filters. And then if there's any override filters, we'll add those as well. Okay, so current row filtering. Are there any values of the current row? Yes, dish equals pasta. So the revisor will add that as a filter, right? So total units, that total units measure is going to add a filter for dish equals pasta. All right, so I click that right there. And the total units measure is going to take this and add it to the filter context. I'm going to hold down Control to make a copy. Again, more accurate to say it moves it. I like seeing it in both places. So we make a little copy, right? It performed current row filtering, and now it's going to ask, are there any override filters? Well, in this instance, if there were override filters, you'd see a little opening parentheses and additional definitions of the override filters. But we don't see those right now. And that's we very rarely actually see those with measures. Measures almost never have override filters associated with them, but they can, and they can do both things. So we've performed current row filtering, and there are no override filters, right, because I don't see any right there. Therefore, the measure is done revising the filters, right? So now we could filter down to dish equals pasta. Dish equals pasta. We click OK. So that is the new revised filter context. Now that we've revised the filter context, total unit says, the filters are just the way I want them. I can unfreeze this sub-expression and run it. So I'm going to go ahead and unfreeze this. Get out the blowtorch. Melt all that ice. There we go. So now I've got my melted sub-expression. It's free to run in these new filters. So we're going to run this in that filter context. So go get all the visible rows of mini, which will just be the pasta rows. Add this column to it, sum up the results. Okay, so I click on those right there. Control-C to copy. Click there. Control-Alt-V to paste special. Assuming I can actually get it to work. Control-Z. Control-Alt-V to paste special. Sorry, my keyboard's misbehaving this morning. Click on values. There we go. There we go. So now I've got all those pasta rows, right? And now we're going to pass it into the sum-X iterator, which is going to add a column with this definition to it and sum up the results. So I'm going to click right here. I'm going to type in EXP. For each and every row, we go get the units for that row. So we get 2 for that row, 1 for that row, 2 for that row. And we sum up the results. 2 plus 1 plus 2 equals 5. That 5 is the answer that the total units measure returns. This measure returns. So we get 5 right there. We get 5 right there. But we're not done, right? We've gotten the answer we want, the number that we want, 5, which is the total units, the total pasta units. But revisers, I should say measures, being revisers are good roommates. And just like the calculate function, when they're done running the sub-expression, they're going to set the filters back to the way they found it, the way they found them. So I'm going to click up here on this little patch of orange, Control-C to copy. Come down here, Control-V to paste over that. That's my way of erasing the filters, setting them back to the way that the total units measure found them. Okay, so we can go ahead and remove this filter right here. We can go look at both burger and salad again. Hooray. And now, we are done with that cell. So I'm going to click there and remove that. Okay, but now we have to run that same code for this row, right? I'm sorry if you thought you were done. We got 2 more of these to do. In fact, we don't have 2 more of these to do. I have 2 more of these to do. You guys just get to watch. I get to do all the hard work. Okay, so now we're going to run that same bit of code, that same definition for our expression column. We're going to run it for this row, right? So we're going to run the total units measure for this row, right? And total units is a revisor, right? So the very first thing we do when we see a revisor is freeze that sub-expression and remind ourselves this is only going to run after we revise the filters. That's what a revisor does, right? So here's what we want to run after we revise the filters. Before we can run this, though, we got to revise this filter specifically to add a filter for burger. So we're just getting those burger units. Okay. So total unit says, before I can run this, let me revise the filter. So I'm going to perform current row filtering. And then if there's any override filters, I'll add them. So for current row filtering, we say, also known as context transition. For that, we say, are there any values of the current row? Yeah, sure there are. dish equals burger. Okay, current row filtering is going to take that and add it as a filter. So I'm going to come down here and type in dish equals burger, right? And the measure will take that someday and add it as a filter. So I'm going to drag that. I'm going to hold down Control and let go, make a copy of it. Again, more accurate to say it moves it, but I'm going to say it makes a copy. That way I can see it both there and there. Okay, so we've performed current row filtering, adding a filter for burger, right? The measure added a filter for burger. Now the measure, if there are any additional arguments here on line 3, which there aren't, if there were, it would add those override filters now, but since there aren't any, and there usually aren't for measures, we're done. We've performed current row filtering and added override filters because there aren't any to add, right? So now that we've got that, we're done revising the filters. So we've got this new filter context with a filter for dish equals burger. Let's see what that looks like. Dish equals burger. Click OK. Good. So now the measure says, I've gotten the filters just right. I can go ahead and unfreeze my sub-expression and run it in this new filter context. I right-click on that. Let's go ahead and unfreeze this. Put it out in the hot, hot sun. There we go. So now I can run this sub-expression. So we're going to go get all the visible rows of mini. In this case, since that's in place, it's just going to be the burger rows. Add this column to it, sum up the results. So I'm going to come up here. Control-C to copy that. Come down here. Control-Alt-V to paste special. Click on values and hit OK. Good. Now I've got all the burger rows, all the burger transactions, right? And so that derivation has produced this temp table right there. So now we're going to add, we're going to pass it into the SumX iterator, which will add this column to it and sum up the results. So here I've got my expression column when I hit enter. When I hit enter, we'll see for each and every row it gets the units for that row. So it gets 1 for that row, 3 for that row, 2 for that row. And it sums them up because it's the SumX iterator. So 1 plus 3 plus 2 equals 6. And that 6 is the actual answer for that cell right there. So go ahead, hit enter, right? But we're not completely done, right? Because the measure, being a reviser, is a good roommate. And by that, I mean it cleans up after itself. And by that, I mean it's going to set the filters back to the way it found them, right? It needed to create a new revised filter context to run this sub-expression. But now that it's done doing that and it's got that number 6, it's going to go set this back to the way it found it. So I'm going to click up here, Control-C to copy. Click on those, Control-V to paste. And up here, I'll be good and remove that filter. Okay, good. It set the filters back, right? Now we're done with that cell right there. Goodness, all this stuff, all this stuff. Okay. There's a lot of it, but as you can see, it's very repetitive. Okay, so we're done with that cell. Now we got to do that exact same thing for this very last row. Gosh, one more? Yeah, one more. We're almost done, I promise. Right? Almost done, I promise. So I'm going to click on that, highlight it right there. So we're going to go run that right there. We're going to do it for that row. Right? And so what's in the definition for this expression column? Well, go run the total units measure. Okay. So the total units measure is a reviser, as you may have noticed, right? And so it's going to revise the filters and run this sub-expression. So to remind ourselves that it only runs the sub-expression after the filters are revised, we're going to go ahead and freeze the sub-expression. Now I'm going to do it here in Excel with this color. When you're actually writing code on your own, you kind of have to do it with your eyeballs. You have to remind yourself that's frozen. It won't run until the filters are revised. Okay. So we've got our frozen sub-expression. Total unit says I need to go revise the filters for that cell right there. Then I can run this. So how's it going to revise the filters? Well, 2 steps. It's going to perform current row filtering. If there's any values of the current row, it's going to add those as filters, right? So dish equals salad. And if there were any override filters, additional arguments to the total units measure, it would add those. And there aren't, so we're actually not going to have to worry about that. But again, I'll show you how that works in a future video. Okay, so it's going to start by performing current row filtering. Are there any values to the current row? Yeah, dish equals salad. Okay, so it's going to take dish equals salad, right? It's going to take this right here. It's going to take that right there, and it's going to move it. I'm going to copy it by holding down Control. It's actually going to move it, but I'm going to copy it and add a filter for dish equals salad. Okay, so it's performed current row filtering, adding that value of salad to the filters, also known as context transition. If there were any additional arguments to the measure, right, if there were parentheses right there and additional stuff, well, those would be override filters, so we would have to add those. But there aren't, so we're all done. We've added current row filters, and there are no override filters, so we're done revising the filters. So now the new filter context is going to show us these rows, just the salad rows. Good, that's our new filter context. The measure breathes a sigh of relief and says, oh, good. I've revised the filters for that cell right there. I can now unfreeze my sub expression, run it, because that's why I revised the filters, because I wanted to be able to run this. So I'm going to click right there. I'm going to click on this and unfreeze it. Unfreeze it. Stick it in the microwave for a few minutes. Good. So now, what's the sub expression that's going to run? Go get all the visible rows of mini, add that column to it, sum up the results. One last time. Select those, Control-C to copy. Come down here, Control-Alt-V to paste special. Click on values and hit OK. So we've derived all the visible rows of mini right there. We're going to pass that into the SumX iterator, which will add a column with that definition to it, an expression column with that definition to it, and sum up the results. So I click right there, I type in EXP, right? I've already done all the hard work and formulas. So as soon as I hit enter, I've actually already pre-populated that. So for each row, and there's only one row, it gets the units for that row. So it goes and gets the units for that row right there. And that's the expression column, and it's going to sum it up. And so for what it's worth, if you were curious, the sum of the number 1 and nothing else is just the number 1. So that number 1 right there is the number of units of salad that got sold. Nobody wants to eat healthy. It's a terrible world. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and replace the measure with 1 because that's what the measure returns. That's the actual answer. But we're not done yet, right? Measures being revisers, right, are excellent roommates, which means they clean up after themselves, which means the total units measure, it created this new revised filter context in order to run the sub expression in it. Now it's going to set the filters back to the way it found it by removing this filter that it added. So I'm going to click right here, Control-C to copy it, and Control-V to paste to simulate setting the filters back to the way it found it, which means we should now be looking at both salad, burger, and pasta. Salad, burger, and pasta. Okay, now and only now are we done with that cell. Now we're done with that cell. And since we're done with that cell, we're actually done adding the expression column to this temp table, right? That's what we've been doing this whole time, right? We've been adding this column to that table right there, Okay, so we're done with that bit. I'm going to go ahead and set this color back. Good. So average X, go get all the dishes. Add a column with this definition to it, and then average the results. There's the table. There's the column we added to it. Now all we have to do is average the results. So I come down here. I do average equals average. I average those, closing parentheses, and I hit enter, and I get 4, which is the average number of units per dish for this particular little restaurant. So I think you can see the way that these measures work is very, very similar to the way that it works for Calculate, because fundamentally we're doing the exact same thing, right? We're doing the exact same thing. For every single row, we're going to revise the filters, adding a filter for that particular row, pasta, burger, or salad, or whatever. Then it will unfreeze and run the sub expression. With Calculate, you actually type out what the sub expression is here in your code. With measures, that sub expression is predefined in your data model. So it's already been defined before, so you only have to type out the name of the measure, which is a bit more intuitive, but it's worth sort of seeing both side by side and just seeing just how similar they are. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed seeing how similar those are, because we're going to keep talking about that some more. Speaking of which, I do hope that was helpful, and I will see you in the next video.